Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome and I'm here to break down UFC Vegas 85, which goes down this weekend. We're back after the 1 week break, and I believe that the breaks have finished for quite a while now. I think that we're going to have a UFC every weekend for the next 3 months, which of course is music to our ears. And in a brief overview to the card at UFC Vegas 85, it doesn't look to be the strongest card on paper across the board, but I'm certainly not going to sit here and complain after the week break that we've just had, coming off the long winter Christmas break that we just had prior to that. So I'm definitely looking forward to the card, and it does look from a general perspective that it's going to be a bit of a wrestling heavy card as well. You know, quite a few wrestlers on this event on the card, and anybody that's been following me and what I prefer to see, I love the wrestling game, I love the grappling game as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to looking at this card, breaking it down, analysing, and then of course on Saturday night sitting down and watching it all play out. But just before we get into the breakdowns, if you are wanting to jump into the action this weekend, then you can use MMA Play 365. We've got plenty on the website for everybody. We've got Base AI, our UFC prediction software, which gives a percentage of every possible outcome of every single fight on the card. We've also got the top 6 within Base AI as well. So the AI algorithms are automatically generating the best 6 percentages across 3 different categories. Of course, the win-loss, the method of victory, and the method of victory plus rounds as well. And then you've got the handicapper section, which is my section, written breakdowns. You've got official bets, so the bets that I'm actually playing and putting money on myself. Then you've got a fun gamblers section for those people that don't take it too seriously and just want to load up on, parlays and, try and throw $10, $20 to win a few hundred, that type of bet. And you get all this in one subscription as well. So the AI and the handicapper advice. And you can even get that from $5 for one event, $10 a month, or $100 for the entire year. So you've got plenty of options there, plenty of betting content. So like I said, if you want to jump into the action, have a bit of fun, play your bets this weekend, then make sure you go to MMAplay365.com. And that's it, we're done with the introductions. Let's get into the fights, let's get into the breakdowns. We start in the main event, a middleweight main event, 5 rounds between Roman Dolidze versus Nassourdine Imavov. And I think this is actually a really good fight, really well put together, makes complete sense. Stylistically, a very interesting fight as well. I genuinely think this is a very, very good main event, and one that is a must watch on the card for sure. Both fighters very well rounded, striking, wrestling, grappling. So both fighters do have this all round game where they are comfortable, or as comfortable as can be wherever the fight goes, rather than being absolute specialists in one area. And that might come more of a surprise to some people with Imavov, because Imavov does have that Thai background, also starts in a bit of a karate stance, sideways stance as well to start his fights, and then the longer the fight goes on, it's hard to sustain a karate stance unless you're somebody like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. I see it time and time again, fighters in these karate stances, and then the longer the fight goes on, the shorter the stance gets, and then they end up in a Thai or boxing stance, whichever that fighter in particular prefers. And it's very similar with Imavov, but Imavov does have this sneaky wrestling and grappling game, and you do see it in glimpses. We saw it last time out against Chris Curtis, of course. That fight did get stopped, and again, I gave my opinions on that on the last podcast. I do think that the fight shouldn't have been stopped, it should have carried on. And look, Imavov, like I said, although he's this really good technical polished striker, he's got a wrestling and grappling game as well. The one problem for Imavov here though is I don't think that he should be using it against Dolidze, because I think that, look, with Dolidze, he's a powerful fighter, he hits hard, he can knock you out, of course. like I said, he's powerful and he's aggressive. He'll come forwards. He'll try and be in your face. But where Dolidze really shines, which is again might surprise some people when they look at the physique of him and the way he's so aggressive on the feet, is that Dolidze is an elite grappler. Like, he is a very, very good grappler. Loves the leg locks as well. Now, these leg locks, even if he's not submitting you from the leg locks, he uses the leg locks as a tool to reverse positions, get himself out of a position, make his opponent panic, try and stand back up to his feet. The leg locks are just really good, and he seems to be able to hit them from anywhere off his back, which is, like I say, it's a real good tool and a real good weapon for Dolidze. Now, the thing is with Imavov, although Imavov is a good grappler, I feel that if he takes Dolidze down, Dolidze's just going to hit one of these leg locks and, like I say, either sweep, submit, or stand up with it. And I think that's a real worry for Imavov. However, the plus side is Imavov, in my opinion, is the better striker, the more technical striker, the more polished striker. He puts combinations together better, likely going to have more volume as well. He's going to be faster with his strikes. He's also more varied with his strikes as well. So not just using punches, but mixing in kicks and knees and elbows. And like I said, when you start putting combinations together, mixing in different areas of attacks and mixing in the kicks with the punches, it starts to become really difficult for the opponent who's not as technical, who doesn't put as much volume in or doesn't seem to put as much volume in. And then from that point, like I said, the opponent does start to struggle a little bit. So for this fight, looking at it stylistically, I think, look, Imavov's going to be the better mover, the better striker. I think he's going to do better work on the feet. He's got to mind his P's and Q's that he doesn't get hit with anything hard from Dolidze. But I feel the way that Imavov loses this fight is if he does try and mix in his wrestling and grappling, because I think that if Dolidze does hit one of these leg locks and let's say he doesn't submit Imavov, I think he's got every chance of getting on top of Imavov, and then Imavov's now got to get up off his back against Dolidze, which he can do. Like, Imavov does have good grappling. However, I don't know if he has great cardio within that grappling. Now, with this fight being 5 rounds, I wouldn't like to think that Imavov's got a really good chance of winning if he's constantly hitting takedowns, getting swept, and then having to work off his back, expend energy, and stand back up to his feet. So for Imavov, I kind of feel like it's in his hands a little bit, because we go back to the wrestling and you look at the wrestling of Dolidze. It is there, and he does have some wrestling, of course he does at this level in the UFC, but I don't think it's super strong wrestling. And I think Imavov does a really good job of defending takedowns and being able to keep himself upright. So the combination of Dolidze's wrestling not being super strong at this higher level in the middleweight division in the UFC, couple that with Imavov's really good takedown defense and being able to keep fights standing up, for me, in my opinion, it comes down to what Imavov does. If Imavov does stay away from the takedowns, I think he wins the fight comfortably. I think if he starts hitting some takedowns, then he might fall into some issues with Dolidze, unless maybe he tires Dolidze out and then in the 4th and 5th round he hits some takedowns when Dolidze is tired and he's struggling to hit the leg lock sweeps, reversals. There's a few different components to this fight, but ultimately I think it's in Imavov's hands. I think if Imavov is smart and doesn't go to the wrestling and grappling early, I think it's a fight that is very winnable for him. So for those reasons, I'm picking Nassourdine Imavov to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, this is a good fight as well. We've got Renato Moicano versus Drew Dober. And it's a great fight because, again, stylistically, it's just got fireworks written all over it, especially in the first round. Renato Moicano is a very, very good starter in his fights. For a guy that is predominantly a grappler, his wrestling has got better. He can hit takedowns on pretty much anyone he fights, but his striking has also been polished really well. So from Moicano's side, when he comes out, he's got good combinations. He's finding, the nose of his opponents on the end of his straight punches, 1-2 combinations, mixing in low kicks, got good counters moving backwards as well, and then he'll hit sporadic takedowns. Once he gets the takedowns, he's a nightmare. He'll just be trying to smother you on top, wait for his opponent to make a move, and then trying to counter off that, whether that's a back take or a transition to a better position. Moicano is a very, very good fighter, specifically in round 1. Now, I'm not saying he falls off a cliff after round 1, but what I'm saying is he does slow down a little bit after the first round. And, everything that I just said about his strike and the sharpness, the combinations, the counters, they're not as prominent after that first round. Then you've got Drew Dober on the other side. Look, Drew Dober is a fighter that is very forward pressure. He'll be in your face. He'll try and land combinations on you. Again, another slick striker. The first round in this fight is going to be super interesting because, like I say, Dober's going to be putting it on Moicano, but Moicano's really sharp in that first round. And then when you look to the grappling, this is where there's a big gap in skill, because I think Moicano on Drew Dober would be an absolute nightmare. Drew Dober on his back with Moicano on top of him is what I'm talking about. So I think that if Drew Dober gets into those positions, he's in real danger because he has been taken down and he has been laid on for a little bit of time against lesser quality jiu-jitsu opponents than Moicano. So, like I say, I think if Moicano's on Dober, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare for him. But the longer this fight goes on, I just wonder what Moicano is going to look like if he hasn't already gotten Drew Dober out of there, which obviously he won't have done if, we're getting late into the fight, because Drew Dober comes on strong late. He's got that cardio. He's got that dog in him that will allow him to keep fighting at a certain pace, and he carries his power throughout the rounds as well. So it is a very interesting fight because I think that Moicano's got the biggest path to victory in this fight, but I think the longer the fight goes on, starts to favour Dober. So, yeah, look, it all depends on how the fight's playing out. Look, if Moicano's being forced to strike with Dober for the majority of the fight, then I think that tires Moicano out a little bit more. If Moicano's able to hit some easy takedowns against Dober and get on top and can sort of get the takedowns as and when he needs them, then I think that's going to serve him much better, not just from a winning the fight perspective, but from a cardio perspective as well. So that's really where I am from an analysis perspective with this fight. But I have to lean towards Moicano because, like I said, he's got the bigger path to victory. I do think that he can hit takedowns. He seems to be able to take anybody down that is fighting, which is a very good sign because although Dober's not bad from a defensive wrestling perspective, he can be taken down, he can be held down. We've seen it before. And like I said, we've seen it before against lesser opponents than what he has in front of him here. So I do think that if Moicano's smart and just, gets the body locks and just trips Dober down rather than trying to hit these big blast double legs or work a single leg, I think that serves Moicano a little bit better. But I do think Moicano can get on top of Dober in a couple of rounds at least. And that tells me enough to be able to say, well, look, if Moicano is getting a takedown in a couple of the rounds, so more than just round one, then he's going to spend a significant amount of time on top, in my opinion. That's going to help his case if the fight does go to a decision. But whilst he's on top of Dober, he's very live for a finish as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Renato Moicano to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is actually a rescheduled fight from UFC 296, which was the last event of 2023. We've got Randy Brown versus Muslim Salikhov. And yeah, look, it's an interesting fight. I've broken this down already, obviously, before Christmas. I'll break it down again for you, no problems doing that. And my prediction and opinion doesn't change at all from that last breakdown. Look, I think that it's a fight that's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think that both fighters have, throughout what we've seen in the UFC, could hit sporadic takedowns, but, how successful they are with the wrestling and then, of course, with the grappling, I just don't see it being a fight that's, has any significant action on the ground. And on the feet, it's a little bit of a strange one because, look, Muslim Salikhov is by far the better technical striker. Like, he's a guy that's had hundreds of kickboxing fights prior to even starting MMA, and you can see that he's a natural kickboxer. And from a technical perspective and how, committed and how hard he throws his strikes is, something really nice to see. And, it's refreshing in MMA. But the problem that he's got here is Randy Brown is, he's not a bad striker himself. And Randy Brown is just going to have a huge height advantage, a huge reach advantage. I think he's going to have a big speed advantage with the strikes as well, being the younger fighter. Muslim Salikhov is getting up there a little bit in age. And of course, it's not just the MMA record you've got to take into account with Salikhov. It's from a combat sports perspective. He's had so many kickboxing fights. So what his body must have gone throughout his career to this point, it's one of them where, Mother Nature eventually kicks in, and you start slowing down as the older you get and the more fights that you've had and the more you've put your body through. And I think Randy Brown's got a fight here where, look, like I say, he's going to have a big reach advantage, a big height advantage, but even in close, so even if you take away that long range and the outside work from Randy Brown's still going to have good elbows in close. He's going to be able to get good dexterity on the knees as well, get them up nice and hard. So I think Randy Brown's just going to be better in more ranges in this fight. And I think in every range, from boxing range, kickboxing range, and even in close, I think that Randy Brown's got some good weapons to use as well. The one thing that I will say that helps Salikhov in this specific fight that wouldn't have helped him at UFC 296 is the cage size. Because the cage size is smaller, I think that Salikhov is going to be presented with a scenario where he's not going to have to work quite as hard in regards to trying to close the distance. Because, look, although Randy Brown's, like I said, is going to be okay in, the close distance, that's also going to be the range that Salikhov is going to be most dangerous and more effective as well. So it is going to be Salikhov that's trying to close the distance. And in the smaller cage, it kind of helps him. Well, it does help him and will help him more than what it would have done at UFC 296 in the bigger cage. But with that being said, like I said, Randy Brown, height advantage, reach advantage, youth advantage, speed advantage. I think he's just got a lot of advantages in this fight, and I just think he's going to be too much for Salikhov. Does have to mind his P's and Q's, especially with that lead leg. Salikhov might just decide to chew up Randy Brown's lead leg, or at least try to. But outside of a few of the real defensive fundamentals that Randy Brown has to be mindful of and will be as a UFC caliber fighter, I do think he gets the job done. So for those reasons, I'm picking Randy Brown to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Viviane Araujo versus Natalia Silva. Now, Natalia Silva, I think, is being worked perfectly in the UFC. She's getting the right fights, right step-ups, different styles. And she's a fighter that I believe genuinely has UFC championship potential. She's one of those fighters that is very good everywhere, but she's also very aggressive. She can be calm in her moments as well. She'll pick her shots. She'll not overexert herself, waste energy. She's a savage, and a very well-rounded savage as well. She's 4-0 in the UFC. She's on a 10-fight winning streak in MMA in general. Her last loss was to actually Marina Rodriguez, but that was 8 years ago. And when you consider that Natalia Silva is not an old fighter, it's that loss that she took was probably a loss that she was just took learning the game and making her way up the ranks in the world of MMA. So look, Natalia Silva, I think, is being played absolutely perfectly, and I think this is another really good step up, but a step up that's needed, and a fight that's very winnable for her as well. Now, Viviane Araujo, she doesn't come without her problems. She's a good striker, especially, like I say, in the first round, she's very sharp. She has unfortunately been known for slowing down the longer the fight goes on, or taking a round 2 off so she can come back in round 3. So the bottom line and the conclusion with that is, she struggles to perform at a similar pace for a full 3 rounds. But like I said, she's got dangerous striking. She's actually got decent wrestling. She's got good grappling as well. But I just kind of think that Natalia Silva is going to be better everywhere. I think that Silva's not going to see anything from Araujo striking-wise that she's not seen before. I think even if Silva does want to just, calm things down a little bit round 1, maybe weather a storm that's coming from Araujo, let that round 1 just get out the way so Araujo slows down, the sharpness and the sting comes off the strikes and the combinations, and then Silva can start building into the fight herself. I think from a wrestling perspective, grappling perspective, once Araujo has slowed down, which, like I said, you have to assume she's going to just because she does in the majority of her fights, I think Silva just takes over. But even in that first round, it's not as if Araujo is like a million times better than Silva anywhere. It's just the fact that Araujo is most dangerous more often than not in that round 1. I still think Silva's the better fighter. Silva might welcome that storm from Araujo to fight fire with fire. And yeah, look, I think Silva's got more ways to win this fight. I think that she could beat Araujo in that storm, or she could weather the storm and just make things a little bit easier the longer the fight goes on. But I think, like I say, I think Silva's a better fighter. She's the better striker, wrestler, grappler, not by a million miles in all those areas, but when you've got even just a little bit of an edge over your opponent in all three of those areas, fights tend to be relatively comfortable, and I think that's what we're going to see here. I think fans are going to be talking about Silva after this fight. Not surprised that she's beaten Araujo, but more like, look, this is a fighter that is genuinely serious now. She's having a step up every single time. She's performing every single time, and I think at some point we're going to see her in that title contention for sure, maybe even a number one contenders fight, and it wouldn't surprise me to ever see a belt wrapped around her waist either. So look, that's Silva from a career progression perspective, but here against Araujo, I think she's going to be too much. I'm picking Natalia Silva to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a really good fight actually. I think it's going to be one that a lot of fight fans, especially the hardcore fans, are going to be circling as a fight that they're really excited to see. We've got Aliaskhab Khizriev versus Makhmud Muradov, and it's a really good fight because look, it's Muradov with the UFC experience. Muradov is definitely more of a well-rounded product than Khizriev in my opinion. You know, striking's good, wrestling's good, grappling's good, but the reason why in my opinion he's a more well-rounded product is because the wrestling, the grappling and the striking are all on a very similar level, whereas you look at Khizriev is predominantly a wrestler. Like, his wrestling is super strong, his grappling is very strong, and to be honest with you, his striking's actually pretty good as well. Like, he's not, I wouldn't say he's as technical as Muradov and as controlled with the strikes, but Khizriev definitely puts short combinations together with power whilst coming forwards. He's not afraid to get hit. He looks like he's got a really good chin as well. But regardless of how well-rounded Khizriev is, like I say, he's more of a predominant wrestler, whereas Muradov is a very well-rounded fighter. But I do think Muradov is going to be in with a really tough fight here. And again, I mentioned it with the Randy Brown and Salikhov fight. I think the cage size really comes into play in this fight. I think if this was the bigger cage, then I think Muradov would have a little bit of an easier time in there. But with this being the smaller cage, it's not going to take a lot for Khizriev to be aggressive and close the distance and shoot on Muradov. I also have some questions about Muradov's cardio as well. Again, it's a bit of a strange one because we've seen him go, you know, longer in fights, looking absolutely fine, but then we've also seen him tired after a round one as well. So it's very inconsistent, the cardio, which becomes very difficult to trust. And then when you look at the fact that he's fighting somebody like Khizriev, who is going to be powering hard combinations at you just to close the distance, to level change and get into the takedowns, and a fighter who will absolutely rinse and repeat takedowns with good cardio, it seems, as well, and a good grappling game, I think that Muradov has got every chance in this fight to have one of those fights where he tires out quicker than what we have seen him before, and I think that's going to be ultimately what happens. Look, Muradov in the initial parts of this fight, I think he's going to do a good job of, you know, defending maybe a couple of takedowns, or even if he is taken down, just getting up a couple of times as well whilst he's fresh and they're both dry. But when Khizriev just keeps coming back to the wrestling, relentless wrestling, shooting, chain wrestling, takedowns, I think the takedowns will start to become a little bit easier the longer it goes on. I think the top control time becomes a little bit longer the longer the fight goes on, and eventually Khizriev will get to him from a longevity perspective. I definitely think earlier in the fight is the potential for Muradov to potentially catch Khizriev and finish him, but look, Khizriev's been hit by some hard shots. And to be honest with you, Khizriev's striking defense isn't great either. So when he does lunge in with these big, powerful strikes, he can get hit. He has been hit. So it's not as if his chin's not being tested or his defense is really good. Like, his defense isn't great, which is not a good thing, but he's been tested. And the fact that he's fine taking those shots because he's closing the distance to get to the wrestling where he wants to get to, that's where he's going to be a bit of a nightmare for some fighters. Look, for Muradov to win this fight, in my opinion, he's got to catch him early, hope that he rocks him or knocks him out, changes the course of the fight either way, or that he can prevent the takedowns and get back up to his feet if he is taken down for a full 15 minutes, but I just don't think he's got the cardio to do that. I kind of feel that this fight is going to look a little bit like the Movsar Evloev and Arnold Allen fight, and I actually broke that down in a very similar way. Look, Arnold Allen, I said, was a tough fighter, but eventually the longer the fight goes on, the more the takedowns come, the easier they get, the longer they stay on top. And again, I've just said that with the Khizriev breakdown on Muradov as well, and I do think it's another one of those fights that looks like that, where Muradov will defensively look okay early on, but the longer it goes on, the more he'll struggle and the more Khizriev takes over. So for those reasons, I'm picking Aliaskhab Khizriev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gilbert Urbina versus Charles Radtke. Now, I was a little bit unsure about this fight, and even seeing Radtke as an underdog before I got into tape was something that I kept my eye on. But, after watching tape, it became more apparent that why Gilbert Urbina is the favourite in this fight, because I think that, Gilbert Urbina is, in my opinion, the best Urbina that we've had in the UFC. Of course, it's, the Urbina family name is the most famous family name in Ultimate Fighter history. There's been a number of the Urbina brothers that have been on there, but I think Gilbert's the best out of all of them. He's striking, he's very light, but he's also got some pop and power on them. But he's also got a good wrestling and grappling game as well. And I think he's a really well-rounded fighter. Now, with Charles Radtke, I think Radtke's well-rounded as well, but I just don't think he's as dynamic as Urbina. I think that Urbina's going to be a little bit faster as well. He puts more combinations together. And look, Radtke in his last fight against Blood Diamond, I just don't think it was that impressive of a win. And I don't think Blood Diamond's a UFC caliber fighter, at least yet. So although he's got good skills, look, I'm not taking anything away from Blood Diamond. That sounded disrespectful. I'm not saying that. I just don't think that he can mix it up yet, because there's elements in his game that are that have got too big of holes in them. But back to Charles Radtke, I think that was a fight that Radtke should have really been properly taking it to Blood Diamond and beating him convincingly. And for the majority of the fight, it was Radtke that was just trying to pin him against the cage. And look, he was doing what he needed to do to win. But when you start leveling up on opponents, which Gilbert Urbina is a massive step up in competition from Blood Diamond, I think that type of game isn't going to work. Charles Radtke is going to be forced to fight here, and I think that's where Gilbert Urbina is going to be able to get at him, and I think that's where Radtke is going to be a little bit exposed. I think Radtke, like I say, he's a decent striker, wrestler, grappler himself, and I'm not saying Urbina's definitively better in every single area, but I just think as a fighter, look, Urbina moves a little bit better on the feet. I think his strikes come from a more dynamic range, dynamic angles. I think that he puts everything together really well. And like I say, if it's Urbina that's shooting takedowns on Radtke and getting him against the cage and getting one hook in and just drowning him a little bit, I think that it's a good fight for Urbina. Radtke, it's not going to be a whitewash. I don't think he's going to get completely run through. He's going to have moments in this fight, but I just don't think those moments are going to be enough, especially over 3 rounds, to beat Urbina. Because look, I think obviously with this being UFC level and wearing 4-ounce gloves and it's MMA, and I say this all the time, I've said it a million times, one punch can change everything. Outside of that puncher's chance, I just don't think Radtke's going to be able to do enough to really get Urbina's respect. I think Urbina's probably got the finishing upside, and if it goes to a decision, I expect Urbina to have won, at least 2 of the 3 rounds. So for those reasons, I'm picking Gilbert Urbina to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a rematch, and I'll be honest, I've got no idea why the UFC is rematching these 2 ladies, but we've got Molly McCann versus Diana Belbita 2. And like I've said before, it was a while ago, a few years ago, Molly McCann won via unanimous decision, got her up there in the numbers, also hit 5 takedowns, I believe, so top control time, wrestling, striking. McCann was just the more well-rounded fighter, but slightly better in every single area, and it showed. And I think that we're going to see something similar. Look, although Molly McCann has been a little bit up and down in a UFC career, I kind of feel that she's hit a level of fighter where we know that she's going to struggle. And that level of fighter is actually, to be fair to Molly McCann, good levels of opponents. Now, the last time out against Julija Stoliarenko, where she was armbarred in round 1 by a woman that will win more often than not by armbar in round 1, it was just one of those. She got caught by a specialist. I don't really put too much stock into it. But McCann's still a good fighter. And Belbita's a good fighter as well. I just don't think either fighter's changed too much from the last time that they fought that's going to make an obvious difference in the outcome of this fight. So I think that Molly McCann's still going to be the slightly better striker. She's going to be in a small cage here where she can be aggressive and come forwards. She doesn't have to close the distance too much. And we know that Molly McCann is forward pressure and loves to be aggressive. And Belbita, I don't think is the type of fighter that's going to be able to stop that forward pressure easily and often. I think that Belbita will be on the back foot a little bit. And again, that's what's going to give Molly McCann, like last time, opportunities to level change and get the fight down to the mat. So, like I said, I don't think there's been too much of a drastic change between either fighter to really change what happened in that first round and alter that outcome significantly. I think we're going to see a very similar fight, and I think we're going to see Molly McCann just being the better fighter here, like she was last time. So for those reasons, I'm picking Molly McCann to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Charles Johnson stepping in on short notice to fight Azat Maksum. Charles Johnson, a quick turnaround as well as a short notice fight as well, so he must still be in shape. But look, Charles Johnson last time out was frustrating. I bet on him against Rafael Estevam, and look, I expected Estevam to maybe hit a couple of takedowns, but Charles Johnson's defensive wrestling and his defensive grappling have always been one of his strongest aspects of fight as a fighter, because it's allowed him to keep fights standing, which is where he's very good himself, and then also allows him to keep the fight standing and maybe mix in some offensive wrestling and grappling himself as well. But in the last couple of fights, we're starting to see some holes in the takedown defense and some holes in the get-up game of him, because that's what it's all about. It's fine if you get taken down, but you've got to be able to get right back up. And when you're laying on your back, both shoulders to the mats, and you're not really doing anything for, 30 seconds to 60 seconds, and you're struggling to work, a fight is going to fall away from you. Now, we've seen against Cody Durden and Rafael Estevam in his last two fights, he's been taken down a lot. So now I am starting to question the defensive wrestling, and especially in the last fight, the defensive grappling, because if Estevam hadn't have gassed out, then Johnson would have got absolutely whitewashed over those 3 rounds. It was only the fact that Johnson had some moments late in round 2 and then all of round 3, which was a result of Estevam tiring out. Now, in comes Azat Maksum. So, look, Maksum, I broke the fight down, his UFC debut at 16-0. He's now 17-0. He won by split decision against Tyson Nam. But this kid's wrestling, the speed of the wrestling is something that I have never seen before in regards to how fast he will enter into takedowns, well timed, and because of that, he does seem to have a high completion rate. The kid's wrestling is absolutely legit. But then he comes into his UFC debut against a fighter who is predominantly a striker, a very boxing-heavy striker in Tyson Nam, and he just isn't shooting the takedowns. He isn't looking anything like he's looked outside of the UFC, and you're thinking, well, what the hell's happening? And look, Maksum did end up winning that fight. He won it by a split decision. Some people think it was controversial, but he did end up getting the win, but he looked nothing like what he looked pre-UFC, and that was a fighter that was super exciting, super quick wrestling. So I am wondering at some point when we're going to see that fighter come back, because he has to come back. You can see that's his game and his style. I don't know whether the UFC debut got to him, the debut jitters, and he just wasn't maybe reading his opponent as well as what he normally is, so therefore he was more hesitant in regards to wanting to shoot takedowns. I don't know, but I do think this is the fight that we see Azat Maksum back. He can't have another fight like last time. If he does, he's going to lose. He will lose against Charles Johnson if he doesn't shoot takedowns here, in my opinion, because Charles Johnson will be able to capitalise on the striking because he's a little bit more dynamic than what Tyson Nam is. So this has to be the fight where we see the Azat Maksum pre-UFC. And if we're right, or if I'm right in saying that, and that is what we actually see inside the cage, then I think that Maksum has a really impressive performance here, because we've seen that Charles Johnson can get taken down. We've seen that he can get controlled on the mat as well by the right opponent. And Azat Maksum is that right opponent. Great wrestling, really good grappling. And he's also got the cardio to do this for 3 rounds as well. So I think that, on paper, this is a good fight for Maksum. I think stylistically it's a good fight for Maksum. He's just got to get over whatever the hell was going on in his last fight against Tyson Nam. But like I said, eventually he will. I can potentially, write that fight off and put that down to maybe UFC debut jitters. I think we see a much more different, dynamic, explosive wrestling style from Maksum in this fight, and for those reasons I'm picking Azat Maksum to win this fight. And staying with the wrestling and the grappling, in the next fight we've got Themba Gorimbo versus Pete Rodriguez. Pete Rodriguez stepping in on short notice to fight Themba Gorimbo, and I'll be honest with you, straight off the bat I think this is a horrific fight for Pete Rodriguez. Pete Rodriguez, he is aggressive, he is powerful. I tell you what, the small cage isn't gonna be unfavourable for him. It means closing the distance less chasing, trying to find the chin of your opponent, but also from a small cage perspective, Gorimbo isn't going to have to wrestle too much in the open mat, and that's where I think the big issue is going to be for Rodriguez within the wrestling, because look, Rodriguez is, like I say, he's always got a possibility of knocking somebody out. He throws with heat, he's aggressive, he tries to get in your face, and he'll put combinations together, but again, he's a bit of a one-round fighter in regards to, if it doesn't happen for him in round 1, then you struggle to see how it's going to happen for him in round 2 and 3. And of course, he does expend a lot of energy in that first round as well. But with Themba Gorimbo I think is just going to be able to get into the hips of Rodriguez, just take him down at will. Rodriguez might get back up once or twice if we're playing the kindness game a little bit. But I think that Gorimbo's wrestling and grappling is just a level above Rodriguez. And to be honest with you, even the striking of Gorimbo isn't terrible. He does have to mind his P's and Q's defensively, because if he does get hit hard with something early on and goes down, then of course he's, the fight's either going to be gone or the course of the fight's going to change if Gorimbo's seriously hurt. But I just can't look past the wrestling and grappling of Gorimbo. It wouldn't shock me in the slightest if the referee said fight and then they closed the distance and Gorimbo just shot straight away for a takedown and finished it in round 1. It really, really wouldn't surprise me. I think Gorimbo's got a massive stylistic advantage here, big gap in skill in the wrestling and grappling, and I think that's going to be a major factor. I'm picking Themba Gorimbo to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Bilder versus Yeong Lee. And this is a very good fight from a stylistic clash perspective. We've got Bilder, who's a very good grappler, decent wrestler. I think the wrestling could potentially be worked on, but from a grappling perspective, Bilder is a very, very good grappler. And then you've got Jeong Lee on the other side, who is an absolute powerhouse of a striker. Now, he's not one of these powerhouse strikers that's stacked and physically absolutely huge. He's more of a sniper with his shots, but he's got very deceptive power on his punches for sure. So the issue I've got for Bilder, and I don't know how many times I'm going to be able to get away with breaking this down, because it's a strange one. You look at Bilder before he got into the UFC, before his Contender Series fight, this dude gets dropped like every single fight. His striking defense isn't really there. He's very hittable. Sure, he's got power himself, but inside the exchanges, he seems to get caught and he gets dropped in every fight. Sometimes he gets dropped multiple times, but he's got this insane recoverability where in the fights that he is getting dropped, he not only recovers, he not only comes back to win the fight, but he normally comes back and finishes the fight as well. So, like I say, Bilder's one of these fighters that has got insane recoverability, but the fact that he gets dropped eventually, and I've said this in the first 2 breakdowns of his UFC fights, I bet him in his UFC debut as well as an underdog, even though I did have these concerns. In the UFC, if you're getting dropped, you're going to lose a round, and you're not going to come back and win these fights and finish these fights as easily in the UFC as you have done on the regional scene outside of the UFC. So at some point you're going to get found out. However, he didn't get dropped against Shane Young. He didn't get dropped last time out either. So I'm just wondering how long I can get away with these types of breakdowns, saying that the chin of Bilder is a bit concerning. I think maybe if there's moments of striking in this fight, long moments, and he gets hit and he doesn't get dropped by Lee, and and then manages to win the fight and get his own game plan going, then maybe we throw it out the window. But right now for this fight, look, Lee does have that deceptive power. And if he does catch Bilder, I do believe that he can drop him. And this is the issue of where I'm at. However, on the other side, Lee, takedown defense, a little bit questionable. he can get controlled on the mat. He does have some submissions off his back. He had that really slick armbar in the road to UFC. But again, you're not going to be armbarring people off your back at this level in the UFC very often, especially with Blake Bilder, who is a very, very good grappler himself. With Blake Bilder's on top, I really don't see Lee trying to throw submissions up. I think Lee will be stuck on his back. So now you've got a fight where on one side, you've got a power striker who's fighting somebody that gets dropped a lot, at least outside of the UFC, as I've already mentioned. Then the other side, the fighter that's getting dropped is also a very good grappler against a fighter on the other side with the power who struggles to defend a takedown and get back up to his feet. So someone's path to victory is going to come out in this fight. I kind of like Blake Bilder's chances, though. I think that, look, if he doesn't get hit with the shots, or if he just is very defensively aware and decides to shoot the takedowns and get the grappling going, I do think he can do good work on top of Lee. I think basically if Lee doesn't crack Bilder, then he's going to struggle. And I kind of feel like Lee's going to struggle on the scorecards as well, because if this fight goes to a decision, in my opinion, that means that Lee's not been able to get his striking going. Because if he does get his striking going, I think he knocks Bilder out. So this is what I mean. This is where I'm at with it. If it goes to a decision, I think Bilder's going to win. But from a finishing perspective, I think Bilder's got just as much chance of finishing on the mat as what Lee has on the feet. So, yeah, that's why I'm sort of leaning towards Bilder. Like I said, there's some cautions on either side for sure. It's a great fight stylistically because you've got the classic striker versus grappler. But I am going to be siding with Bilder. I'm picking Blake Bilder to win this fight. And in the next fight, we mentioned her earlier on, we've got Julija Stoliarenko versus Luana Carolina. Now, Julija Stoliarenko, as we mentioned earlier, she is the armbar round one queen. If it's not an armbar in round one, she's going to struggle to win a fight. And that is where I have a huge issue with Stoliarenko and other fighters like Stoliarenko with that one specific path to victory in the UFC, because in the UFC, you have to be dynamic with your style. You have to be well-rounded because you're going to be facing different quality of opponents, but fighters that are good in different areas, and you've got to be able to switch up a game plan and change things up as and when needed. But Stoliarenko just doesn't seem to be able to do that. She is a round one armbar or bust more often than not. I'm not saying every fight, but more often than not, she's armbar, round one, bust or bust. And I think with Luana Carolina, look, Carolina, is she the type of fighter that's going to end up in an armbar in round one? Maybe. I don't think Carolina's sort of like top level of the division. A great ranked fighter that's going to be able to comfortably go down with Stoliarenko and stay out the way of the armbar in round one. I think there's a possibility of Stoliarenko's path to victory coming true here, but Carolina is more well-rounded. She's really good on the feet as well, really aggressive. She'll strike with straight punches. She'll put her opponents on the back foot, and I do think there's a game plan here for Carolina to make this quite comfortable for her. And in my opinion, that is, look, be aggressive, push Stoliarenko back, but as soon as Stoliarenko gets anywhere near her back to the cage, Carolina just to come back out into the centre, because I think where Stoliarenko is going to be able to get this fight down is when Carolina gets too close, and when her back hits the cage, she'll bounce off it and come forwards as a reactionary moment to clinch up and then potentially get a trip down to the mat. So, and look, Carolina, I don't think is going to be looking for takedowns in this fight to, engage Stoliarenko's armbar off the back. So I do think that if Carolina minds her P's and Q's in this fight, has that good game plan, doesn't get tied up too much, gets out of that first round okay, I think she's the better striker. She's the fighter that's going to pour it on the longer the fight goes on. And Stoliarenko, again, as much as I hate to say it, she does look like one of those fighters that when that real specific path to victory doesn't get hit, she just tends to struggle the longer the fight goes on because she's sort of ran out of options a little bit. I think that, look, I'm not going to be shocked if Stoliarenko armbars Carolina in round one, but I can't side with, and I don't normally side with, the fighter that has to get a finish in round one, especially when that finish is, a specific submission. So for those reasons, I'm picking Luana Carolina to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is one that I've been back and forth on. We've got Marquel Mederos making his UFC debut against Landon Quinones. Now, if this was before Landon Quinones' UFC debut against Nasrat Haqparast, I think I'd be all over Mederos in a big way. Like, look, Mederos fights out of Factory X, so you know that A, has got high-level coaching, B, has got high-level training partners. I wouldn't say he's specifically, like, really young. I'm pretty sure he's, like, 27, 28, so he's in his prime right now, but he is still improving from fight to fight, and you can see that he's improving from fight to fight. However, you go back and watch the fights outside of the Contender Series fight, and Mederos does look a little bit green. You can still see there's moments in his fights where you can tell that he's green and he's learning and he's still got areas to develop in. Whereas with Landon Quinones, I'm not saying he's a finished product. I'm sure he's still developing himself. You know, the records aren't too dissimilar between each fighter, so they've got a similar amount of experience. But Landon Quinones looks more settled, more confirmed as a fighter, if that makes sense. And look, you watch that Nasrat Haqparast fight, there is the potential of that being just a very, very good performance from Quinones. Just like fighters have bad nights, some fighters can have sort of overachieving nights, if that makes sense. I don't know whether Quinones just overachieved there against Haqparast. I know he lost the fight, but the dude put up over 100 plus strikes. He was a massive underdog. UFC debut. I think it was short notice as well against Haqparast, who is a beast in the division. And Quinones steps in there and puts it on Haqparast. Man, that was a war. If that's the Quinones we get here against Mederos ain't winning this fight. I just feel that there might have been an element of overachieving with Quinones there, but that doesn't mean that he's a bad fighter and, you know, can't fight anywhere close to that. I think he's got that in him. But like I say, with Mederos, there's moments where you see him really slick. He's in and out of range. He's landing to the body, to the head. And again, you've got to take into consideration the Factory X gym, the training partners, the coaches there. These guys are really good at Factory X. And this is why I've been backwards and forwards here, because I think Quinones is a more solid fighter as of right now, but Mederos is making the developments, and we could see a much different fighter here inside the cage than what we've seen previously. And then you had the team behind him. It's a tough fight to call, but I am going to stick with what I've seen and not what I'm potentially going to see, and that's that Landon Quinones is the more stable and defined fighter right now. So for those reasons, I'm picking Landon Quinones to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Thomas Peterson making his UFC debut against Jamal Pogues. Now, this fight is, again, I don't mean any disrespect here, it's a low-level heavyweight fight in the UFC, and one that, again, I don't know how anybody can really trust the outcome of this fight. So, look, if you've got the balls to be playing this on, you know, what the book is, you know, picking a side on the money line, then, you know, good luck to you. I hope you cash your ticket, but it's just not one for me. And look, Thomas Peterson, his style and potential is definitely greater than Jamal Pogues, in my opinion. You know, he's a wrestler. He does look for the wrestling. That's all. That's what you always want to see. If a fighter's a wrestler, you don't want to see him hesitating at this level, struggling to hit takedowns, because they're just, that type of fighter is just not going to progress in the UFC at all, because you need that active style that got you to where you are right now in the UFC. But Peterson, like I said, he does shoot his takedowns. He does look to get on top of his opponents. The one thing that I will say with these heavyweights is you don't need the best topside grappling to be able to keep your opponent down, because when a 265-pound man has got another 265-pound man on his back, then it's very difficult for a 265-pound man to just, you know, get the hips out and scramble straight back up to the feet. The bigger men, and it's harder to do. It's almost like expecting a flyweight to have the same amount of power on a punch as a heavyweight. You know, there's different advantages for different weights, and one of the disadvantages for a heavyweight is that you're going to, even as a big man, you're going to struggle getting a 265-pound man off the top of you. So that really is going to work for Thomas Peterson in the UFC. And, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how much he can grow. Jamal Pogues is a fighter that is very meat and potatoes. He's got an all-round style where he'll look to strike. I said this in previous breakdowns for Pogues. I preferred him in his fight, in one of these fights in the Contender Series. I can't remember if it was the first or the second one. I think it was the first one, where he was hitting takedowns, where he was wrestling, and then In fact, it was that first one because he didn't get into the UFC, didn't get that contract. And I think that he might have thought, that's because of the wrestling. I'm not going to wrestle anymore. And then now he's turned into this point scoring striker, and he's not the most technical or elusive striker. So I think that Pogues needs to go back to his wrestling at some point just to get some wins on the board. But is this the right fight for him to do it? Because Peterson's a wrestler himself. If Pogues goes wrestling with wrestling against Peterson, does he come out on top? I'm not sure he does. I think Peterson here, I don't think he's going to force the striking too much. I think he'll get straight into the wrestling, get straight into the takedowns. And if he gets Pogues down a couple of times, I think Pogues is going to have a real problem getting back up to his feet. Even if it's just from the size perspective. Peterson isn't this lethal, legit BJJ black belt where he's going to absolutely slice through his opponents, on top side. He's good top side, but he's just not that lethal grappler. So it's not as if Pogues has got that on top of him. But like I said, just 265-pound man trying to get back up off his back and stand back up is difficult. So I do think Peterson is going to come into this fight with a game plan to get this fight down to the mat. I think Pogues might have some moments up until the moment where he's against the cage and looking to defend takedowns, but ultimately I think Peterson can get the takedowns he needs and really make this a tough fight for Pogues and beat him. So for those reasons, I'm picking Thomas Peterson to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you are listening on one of the podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, then you can come over to the YouTube channel if you want to drop a comment, discuss any of the fights, tell me who you're betting on, and we can have that conversation on YouTube. And of course, if you do land on our YouTube, I really appreciate it if you just subscribe to our channel. It costs you absolutely nothing, but really helps myself and MMA Play 365 as well. And whilst we're on the topic of MMA Play 365, again, if you're wanting to get into the action this weekend, then make sure you do so by going on to MMA Play 365's website, where we've got plenty of betting content from the AI, from the handicapper, which is myself, and you get that all together in every subscription. It's not as if we try and, sell the AI on one package and then the handicapper advice on another package. It's all together. It's all really affordable, adds to the fun onto the night, earns you some money as well. Let's get it. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.